What happens when the one person you trust the most betrays you in the worst possible way? The person you've loved, built a life with, and trusted with your heart, only to find out they've been hiding a secret that shatters everything you thought you knew. The very foundation of your world starts crumbling piece by piece as you discover that the person who should have had your back has been deceiving you all along. Betrayal is a poison that seeps deep into your soul, twisting everything you thought was true. It's not just about the lies or the secrets. It's the sheer weight of the broken trust, the feeling that everything you once held dear was nothing more than a mirage. It cuts deeper than any physical wound, leaving scars that can never be healed. The impact can be all-encompassing, shaking your sense of self, your identity, and your place in the world. For Brandon Webb, the pain of betrayal didn't just break his heart, it shattered the very essence of his existence. His wife, Natalie, the woman he'd trusted with everything, had a secret life he knew nothing about. She had been living in a world that Brandon was never part of, hiding her own truth behind a mask of affection and promises. She was the mother of his children, his partner, his confidant, but behind closed doors, everything was different. When Brandon found out the truth, it didn't just sting, it devastated him. The anger, the confusion, the overwhelming sense of being lost in a world that no longer made sense. There was no coming back from it, and in that moment, when the full scope of the betrayal hit him, something inside Brandon snapped. What happens when a man, pushed beyond his breaking point by the person who should have been his rock, is forced to confront the deepest pain he can imagine? When the lines between love and hate blur so completely that the consequences become irreversible. This is not just the story of a broken marriage, it's the story of a man driven to the edge, a man whose life spiraled into darkness as a shocking truth was uncovered. And in the end, it would lead him to make a decision that no one could have seen coming. Welcome to the True Crime Journal HQ. If you're already hooked, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling true crime stories. Your support helps us bring more of these shocking tales to life. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you found out the person you loved most had been hiding a life of deceit? Stay tuned to find out what happens next. Brandon Webb's life was one of simplicity, routine, and devotion to his family. A mechanic by trade, Brandon spent his days fixing cars in the small town of Brooksville, a place where the slow-paced life suited him perfectly. There was something deeply satisfying about working with his hands, fixing things that others couldn't. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it provided for his family and kept food on the table. The kind of work where the fruits of his labor were tangible, the satisfaction of a job well done always in reach. For Brandon, there was no need for extravagance, just the peace of knowing that his family was taken care of and safe. Brandon and Natalie's relationship had always been rooted in the kind of simplicity that many might envy. They had been high school sweethearts, and despite the challenges that life had thrown their way, they never wavered in their commitment to each other. Their love was the kind that was easy to overlook at first glance, quiet, unassuming but incredibly deep. It was the type of bond that made others believe in true love. They married young, full of optimism and dreams, and in their eyes the future was bright. Together they built a life, one that was grounded in family and love. Natalie had always been the emotional anchor for Brandon, a vibrant woman with an unshakable belief in family values. They had 2 children, Jessica and Evan, and those children filled their home with noise, laughter, and the constant chaos of raising young ones. It was this chaotic bliss that made Brandon feel like his world was complete. As a father, Brandon was everything his children could want. He was patient and attentive, always the first to volunteer to help with homework or attend parent-teacher conferences. He never missed a soccer game or a school play, always making sure that his children knew they were his top priority. His devotion to them was unwavering, and it was the center of his life. Natalie, for her part, was the heart of their family. She managed the home with a level of care that Brandon had always admired. While he was busy in the garage, Natalie kept the household running smoothly, making sure the kids had everything they needed and maintaining a sense of peace in the home. She was the glue that held everything together, balancing the demands of parenting with her own career and personal interests. She was Brandon's equal partner in every way, a woman who supported him with unwavering love. For all intents and purposes, Brandon and Natalie were living the American dream. They were the kind of family that others looked at and thought, they have it all together. On Sundays, they gathered around the dinner table, where they would share their week's experiences. It was their tradition to sit down together and enjoy a meal. Nothing extravagant, just a comforting family meal. They talked about everything from Jessica's recent dance recital to Evan's struggles with math. It was during these moments that Brandon felt his life was the most complete. The world outside might have been chaotic, but inside their home, there was peace. For Brandon, this was enough. But as with most things in life, nothing stays the same forever. What appeared to be a perfect life was on the cusp of a major shift. Brandon couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it began, but something in their world started to change. It wasn't an explosive event. It wasn't as though one day things were perfect, and the next day everything fell apart. No, the cracks began slowly, almost imperceptibly, but once Brandon began to notice, they were impossible to ignore. In 2015, the storm began. It started with a phone call that Brandon would never forget. He was arrested, charged with a robbery that had gone wrong, an event that he had no part in. Brandon had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, an unfortunate victim of circumstance. He had tried to help in a desperate situation, but things had spiraled out of control, and he found himself facing charges that would change the course of his life forever. Natalie stood by him at first. She continued to visit him during his initial time in prison, bringing their children along, trying to keep a semblance of normalcy for their sake. It was hard on her, but she remained a constant presence in his life. She would sit across from him in the visitation room, her face filled with worry, but she always smiled and assured him that they would get through this. But as the months wore on, things began to feel different. Brandon could sense it, a subtle shift in Natalie's demeanor that he couldn't quite explain. Her visits started to feel more distant. Their conversations grew shorter, and she seemed more withdrawn. At first, Brandon chalked it up to the stress of their situation. After all, dealing with the financial strain, the children and the uncertainty of the future must have been weighing heavily on her. But as the months passed, the tension between them grew. Natalie, the woman who had once been his rock, seemed to be slipping further away, and Brandon couldn't understand why. The love they had built their life on now felt like a fragile memory, one that was beginning to fade as the reality of their circumstances took hold. It wasn't just Natalie's growing emotional distance that troubled Brandon. It was the feeling that their once perfect life was slipping through his fingers. Every visit, every conversation, every letter began to feel like a reminder that the life they had worked so hard to build was beginning to fall apart. There were no arguments or dramatic confrontations, no overt signs of trouble, just a slow, painful drift that left Brandon feeling helpless and isolated. The day the letter arrived, Brandon had no idea that it would be the start of his emotional descent into a world of betrayal and confusion. At first, it seemed like just another routine piece of correspondence, perhaps an update from his lawyer or some administrative paperwork from the prison system. But as he tore open the envelope, his heart sank. The handwriting on the letter was unmistakable, his wife's. It wasn't the letter he had been waiting for, the one that would bring good news of a possible appeal or progress on his case. Instead, it was a short, scribbled note. Something about the hurried nature of the words unsettled him instantly. He could feel the weight of the paper in his hands, the sharpness of the moment, a moment that, when he looked back, would mark the beginning of his unraveling. At first, the words seemed to blur together. His eyes quickly scanned the letter, trying to make sense of what it said. Natalie spoke about financial troubles, the mounting pressure of managing everything on her own while he sat behind bars. She mentioned how things had been tough, how she felt overwhelmed. It wasn't unusual for Natalie to be open with him about the difficulties of holding down the fort while he was incarcerated, and Brandon had always tried to be understanding, always comforting her from afar. But this time was different. Something was off. There was an anxiety in her words that he had never noticed before. Then came the line that stopped him cold. "I've made a terrible mistake, Brandon. I need to tell you everything when you're free. Please don't hate me. I love you." Brandon sat in silence, the letter still in his trembling hands. His mind raced with 100 different questions. What did she mean by a terrible mistake? He reread the words, his heart pounding in his chest. Was she confessing to something? His thoughts went wild. Could she have been hiding something from him this entire time? Was she seeing someone else? Was this some sort of cryptic admission of guilt that he couldn't yet understand? The doubt gnawed at him relentlessly. Every assumption he had made about his marriage, about the woman he loved, now felt like it was in jeopardy. Brandon thought about all the years they had spent together, their children, the quiet promises they had made to each other in their younger years. How had it all gone wrong? What had he missed? As his thoughts circled, the suffocating weight of uncertainty pressed down on him. He had no answers, no clarity, only questions. Brandon felt helpless. He thought back to their last conversation before he was arrested. It had been normal, too normal perhaps. They had spoken about the kids, about the usual routines, about how much he missed them. But now, with this letter in his hands, he began to see a pattern he hadn't noticed before, a deeper layer to their relationship that had always been hidden just beneath the surface. His mind began to spiral. What was Natalie hiding? The questions flooded him one after the other, each more unsettling than the last. And why had she chosen to tell him this now, while he was behind bars? Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or had she simply been unable to continue living the lie? Brandon's suspicions grew stronger with each passing day. He began to look at the letter differently, analyzing the phrasing, the tone. There was a desperation in her words, a sense of urgency that made him feel as though something was terribly wrong. But what? And why didn't she just tell him everything outright? Unable to rest, Brandon turned to the only resource available to him in prison, his network of fellow inmates. Over the next few weeks, he began asking around, using the connections he had within the prison system to dig deeper. It was risky, but he felt he had no choice. This wasn't just about some vague emotional misstep. Something far bigger was at play, and Brandon needed to know what it was. The rumors he uncovered were worse than anything he could have imagined. According to several of the men, Natalie had been seen with a man. Not just any man, a man from their town, a man Brandon had never met. The whispers were vague at first, but the more Brandon pressed, the clearer the picture became. This man had appeared in Natalie's life shortly after his conviction. Brandon felt a knot form in his stomach. Who was this man? Was this the terrible mistake Natalie had referred to in her letter? He dug further, pushing for more information. The prison had its own informal network, where information flowed freely if you knew the right people, and Brandon, though incarcerated, had always been resourceful. He found out that this man, his name was Ryan Lawson, wasn't just some stranger passing through. He was a businessman from the area, a man with a reputation that didn't sit well with some of the people Brandon had talked to. Ryan's past was murky at best. Brandon's sources spoke of Ryan's involvement in various shady dealings, fraud, manipulation, the type of minor criminal activity that didn't land him in prison but left a trail of victims behind him. There were whispers of his ability to charm his way out of trouble, of his smooth-talking ways that made people overlook his more questionable actions. But nothing seemed serious enough to get him into real trouble. The more Brandon uncovered, the more his suspicions solidified. Ryan had been part of Natalie's life for longer than he had realized, and their relationship had deepened in ways Brandon hadn't imagined. The truth hit him like a freight train. Natalie had been having an affair with Ryan. She had been seeing him for over a year. She had been lying to him, hiding a part of her life that he knew nothing about. Brandon felt the weight of humiliation crushing him. His trust, his love for Natalie, had all been misplaced. He had been blind to her secrets, to the life she had built without him. It wasn't just the affair that cut him. It was the layers of deception, the financial betrayals, and the lies she had told him to keep up the facade of their perfect life. The final blow came when Brandon learned the full extent of Natalie's financial deceit. She had taken out loans in his name, loans they couldn't afford, and used the money to fund her secret life with Ryan. Brandon's name had been used to secure credit, leaving him in debt and helpless. Everything about the life he thought they had shared now seemed like an illusion, a twisted version of reality built on lies. As the months in prison dragged on, Brandon found himself sinking deeper into a spiral of despair. Each day blended into the next, and the slow rhythm of prison life began to wear down his once hopeful spirit. The world outside, once vibrant and full of possibility, now felt like a distant memory. He could no longer hold on to the comforting thought that life would one day return to normal. With every passing day, the walls of his prison grew taller, and the sense of isolation became more suffocating. What tormented Brandon more than the confinement was the gnawing realization that the person he had trusted most in this world, Natalie, was no longer the woman he had once known. The woman he had married, the one who had promised to stand by him through thick and thin, had betrayed him in ways he couldn't have fathomed. It was one thing to be physically trapped behind bars, but it was something far worse to feel trapped emotionally, knowing that the person you loved most had abandoned you too. The discovery of Natalie's affair had been devastating, but it was the emotional and financial ramifications of that betrayal that truly began to chip away at Brandon's resolve. He had always been a man who believed in the sanctity of his marriage. To learn that Natalie had been seeing someone else, someone who had wormed his way into their lives, was a cruel blow. But it wasn't just the emotional wound that stung. It was the deeper, more insidious damage that Natalie had caused. She had plunged them into debt, taking out loans in Brandon's name, using his trust to secure a life without him. Brandon had always prided himself on being a provider, someone who took care of his family. But here he was, behind bars, unable to protect his family from the financial ruin that had been set in motion by his wife's betrayal. Each letter that arrived from the outside only served to reinforce the bleakness of his situation. He had no way to fix what was broken. The money Natalie had spent on her new life, the loans she had taken, the lies she had spun, they were all part of a world that Brandon no longer recognized. Even from behind prison walls he could feel the weight of it. Bills piled up, debts that he could never repay. His life, once built on a foundation of hard work and sacrifice, now felt like a fragile house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. The anger that simmered inside him became harder to control. It wasn't just the affair that gnawed at him, it was the profound sense of helplessness. He had been wrongfully convicted, and now, in addition to the loss of his freedom, he was losing his family, his home, and his dignity. Brandon's frustration grew with each passing day, the injustice of it all making it harder for him to see any way out of his misery. It was in the summer of 2020 when Brandon received the letter that would deal the final blow to his already shattered sense of hope. Natalie had filed for divorce. The words struck him like a physical blow. Irreconcilable differences, the papers said. Those words, so cold and impersonal, stripped away any remaining sense of respect he had for their relationship. It wasn't just that she was ending their marriage. It was the way she had chosen to do it. No explanation, no attempt to reconcile. Just a legal document that effectively erased him from her life. Brandon stared at the divorce papers in disbelief. He had never expected things to end this way. When he had first been arrested, he had told himself that once proven innocent, things would go back to normal. He would come home and they would pick up where they had left off. But now, that hope felt like a distant memory. The love he had for Natalie seemed like a lifetime ago, swallowed by the reality of what had happened between them. The woman he had once trusted with his heart and his children had moved on, leaving him behind to rot in a prison cell. The thought of her with another man, starting a new life without him, crushed him. It wasn't just the affair or the financial deceit that burned inside him, it was the emotional abandonment. When Brandon had first been arrested, Natalie had promised to stand by him, to visit, to keep the family together. But as the months turned into years, her visits grew less frequent, and the conversations during those brief moments of contact became more strained. It was as if she was slowly retreating from him, from their life together, from the family they had built. In early 2021, things reached their breaking point. Natalie stopped visiting altogether. The once familiar routine of seeing her every few weeks, of holding on to some semblance of their past, vanished. Her letters grew less frequent and more distant. And then, one day, they stopped altogether. There was no explanation, no goodbye, just an empty void where their connection once existed. The silence was deafening. Brandon was left alone with his thoughts, trapped not only by the walls of the prison but also by the emotional distance that had grown between him and the woman he had once called his partner. It was in this isolation that Brandon's anger began to fester. He had never imagined that the woman he had loved for so long could do this to him, could so easily walk away from their life together, leaving him to suffer in a place that had already stripped him of everything else. Brandon's feelings of abandonment reached their peak. His entire world had been shattered. His family was gone. His freedom was a distant dream, and now even the woman who had promised to love him through it all had chosen to leave him behind. There was nothing left for him to hold on to. No hope, no future, no connection to the life he had known. It was as if he had become a ghost, watching his own life slip away without any way to stop it. The summer of 2021 brought a twist that Brandon had never expected. One morning, as he went about his routine in prison, a guard handed him an envelope that would change the course of his emotional trajectory. It was a visitor pass. The name on it made his heart skip a beat. Natalie. His wife. She wanted to see him, wanted to meet with him in person, after everything that had happened. Brandon stared at the pass, stunned. Why? After everything that had transpired between them, why would she reach out now? After the affair, the divorce papers, and the complete emotional abandonment, why did she want to meet him? He felt a rush of conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, frustration. There was no clear reason for her to suddenly want this meeting, but part of him wanted closure, and part of him wanted answers. He had been waiting for some sign, some way to understand what had gone wrong in their marriage. Perhaps this was his final chance to get answers. He could end the uncertainty that had been gnawing at him for so long, or he could be left with even more questions. Either way, he knew that this meeting would be the pivotal moment in their relationship. Whether it brought closure or crushed him further, it would define the final chapter of his marriage. Brandon agreed to the meeting. As he made his way to the visitation room, his mind was a whirlwind. He wondered if she would apologize, if she would beg for his forgiveness, or if she would try to justify her actions. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that whatever happened, it would change everything. When the day arrived, he was escorted to the visitation room. The walls were grey, the air stale, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, making the entire room feel cold and sterile. As the door opened, there she was, Natalie, sitting across the table. Her eyes were red, her face pale, and she looked older. There was a weariness in her expression that Brandon hadn't seen before. It hit him instantly that something was different. He could see the guilt in her eyes even before she spoke. It was as if she was already apologizing, trying to explain the unexplainable, to justify the unforgivable. She looked up at him, her gaze filled with a kind of sadness that only deepened the pit in his stomach. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come easily. "Brandon," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for things to turn out this way. I don't even know how it all happened." Brandon's eyes locked on hers, but his heart was numb. The apology, the soft, tremulous tone, it felt so hollow. How could she say sorry now, after everything? After the lies, the deceit, the betrayal? Words meant nothing anymore. They were just empty sounds, like the millions of other apologies he had heard from others in his life. Apologies that had no weight, no real meaning behind them. "You're sorry?" Brandon's voice was quiet but sharp. The words stung, but they needed to be said. "So you're sorry for what? For the affair? For the lies? For turning our entire life upside down and walking away like none of it mattered?" His voice rose, filled with a bitter edge, the hurt and frustration creeping into every word. "You think sorry is going to fix this? After everything?" Natalie flinched at the harshness of his words. She looked down at the table, and for a moment there was silence. The kind of silence that filled the room with an unbearable tension. Brandon's chest tightened as he looked at her, a wave of anger washing over him. He had spent so many nights in prison, trapped in his own thoughts, trying to understand what had gone wrong. How had she done this to him, to their children? He could feel the years of hurt flooding his body like an uncontrollable wave. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Brandon, Natalie stammered, her voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted things to get so out of control. But I was lonely. I didn't know what to do, and then Ryan came into my life and everything just changed. Brandon's fists clenched involuntarily, the anger surging through him like wildfire. Ryan. The name alone ignited a fury he couldn't contain. The man who had replaced him, the man who had taken everything from him. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a sharp intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Ryan, he spat, his voice thick with contempt. That's the name you're going to throw at me now. The man who took my wife, the man you chose over me. And you want me to believe that you didn't mean for any of this to happen? He leaned in closer, his gaze unrelenting. How long, Natalie? How long were you lying to me? How long were you living your double life while I rotted in here? Her face twisted with emotion as she tried to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at him, tears streaming down her face. The sight of her, the woman he had once trusted completely, now broken and pleading, only deepened the wound. His heart, which had once been full of love for her, now felt cold and hard. Brandon, please, Natalie cried, her voice pleading. Please, I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. I always have. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. Can't you see that? Can't you understand that I'm not the same person I was? You love me? Brandon repeated bitterly. How can you say that? How can you love me and do this to me? How can you sit there and ask me for forgiveness when you've destroyed everything, everything I thought we had? You left me here all alone while you moved on with him. You think I love you will fix that? His voice grew louder, each word a release of the years of pain he had kept bottled up. You're not the woman I married anymore, Natalie. You're someone else, someone I don't even recognize. Natalie's tears fell faster now, but Brandon wasn't done. His rage and grief collided in an uncontrollable burst. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent room. The guards, noticing the escalating tension, stepped forward, but Brandon barely registered their presence. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, Brandon said, his voice a mixture of anger, sadness, and defeat. You've destroyed everything I ever cared about. You've destroyed me. The guards moved in, and Brandon was escorted out, but not before one final glance at the woman he had once loved. She was still crying, her face contorted in pain, but it no longer mattered. The trust was gone, the love gone with it. In that moment, Brandon knew he had been broken beyond repair. The conversation between Brandon and Natalie had reached a boiling point. Each word they exchanged felt like a razor, cutting deeper into the raw wounds of their broken relationship. Brandon had spent the last few years in a cage, trapped not just by prison walls, but by the emotional chains of betrayal and abandonment. Now face to face with the woman who had shattered everything he believed in, his heart pounded with the rage of years of emotional torment. Everything he had endured in prison, the loneliness, the fear, the hopelessness, now collided with the anger that had been growing inside him since the moment he first discovered Natalie's lies. The words she had spoken, the tearful apologies, the promises of love, the painful confessions, seemed like nothing more than empty noise to him now. Nothing could undo the betrayal. Nothing could erase the images of her life with Ryan, of the love they had shared, now shattered into a million pieces. Every inch of his being screamed in disbelief. How could she do this to me? How could she look me in the eyes and still claim to love me after everything? Brandon's mind raced, the walls around him closing in. His chest tightened with a fury that felt all-consuming. The reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. She was the one person in the world he had trusted, the one person who had promised to stand by him. But here she was, with tears in her eyes, trying to explain her actions, asking for his forgiveness. All of it, it was too much. His heart, already shredded by the truth of her betrayal, couldn't take it anymore. The anger that had been simmering for years reached a fever pitch. His pulse surged, his vision narrowed, and in that split second, everything he had once known about himself, about love, about forgiveness, vanished. Brandon's hand shot out instinctively, as if he had no control over it, no say in what his body was about to do. The chain around his neck, the one he had worn since he was a teenager, was his only physical link to a life that now felt distant. He grabbed it, his fingers shaking with the violent energy coursing through him. His body, moving on pure adrenaline, yanked the chain tighter. The act was impulsive, driven by the overwhelming flood of anger and betrayal that overwhelmed him completely. It happened so quickly that even Brandon was taken aback. One moment, he was sitting across from Natalie, the woman who had been his partner for years, and the next, his entire world turned upside down. Natalie's gasp echoed in the room, the horror flashing in her eyes as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. She tried to pull away, her hands fumbling at her throat, but it was too late. Brandon didn't know how long it lasted. Time seemed to slow, the minutes stretching into eternity as he acted on nothing but raw emotion. The weight of everything, the lies, the years of pain, the crushing realization that the woman he had loved had betrayed him so completely, seemed to crash into him all at once. It was as if the entire world had collapsed into this one moment. His grip on the chain tightened. He could feel Natalie's breath growing more shallow, her body thrashing as she struggled to break free. But Brandon didn't stop. The emotions he had kept buried for so long, anger, pain, humiliation, and betrayal, all exploded in that moment. His vision was clouded with rage, his mind consumed by the only thought that mattered to him now. She had done this to him. She had taken everything from him. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Brandon stood there, gasping for breath, staring at Natalie's lifeless body in front of him. The room was eerily silent, the weight of what he had just done settling over him like a heavy shroud. His mind raced, but there were no words, no rational thoughts. His chest heaved, his breathing ragged, and he stared down at the woman who had once been his entire world, now nothing more than a broken shell lying motionless before him. The finality of it all crushed him in that instant. He felt nothing but shock. His heart, still racing, felt like it might burst from his chest. The adrenaline from the violent act coursed through his veins, but there was no sense of relief, no satisfaction. Instead, there was an empty, hollow ache that left him feeling more lost than ever before. What had he done? How had it come to this? Brandon stumbled back, his legs weak beneath him, as he collapsed into the chair, his eyes never leaving Natalie. His mind was a blur of guilt, confusion, and horror. The woman he had once trusted with his heart and his children, now gone. And it was his fault. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of his labored breathing. He was trapped, his mind in freefall. He had never envisioned himself capable of this, of taking another life. Yet here he was, standing over the woman who had once been his everything, knowing that there was no way to undo the violence he had just unleashed. The footsteps of the guards outside the door grew louder. He could hear them approaching, but it no longer mattered. The weight of what he had done felt like it was crushing him from the inside out. The momentary high of his outburst was gone, replaced with a deep, unshakable sense of dread. This was it. There was no going back now. The door opened with a loud creak, and two guards rushed in, their faces frozen in disbelief as they took in the scene before them. But Brandon didn't move. He didn't try to run, didn't try to escape. He simply sat there, staring at the lifeless form of the woman he had once loved. The world around him felt unreal, distant, as if he were watching the scene unfold through a haze. The guards moved toward him, their presence jolting him back to reality. They grabbed him, pulling him away from the scene, but Brandon barely noticed their touch. He was numb, his body limp, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of which made any sense. The man he had been, the man who had built a life with Natalie, was gone, and in his place was someone else, someone broken, someone capable of unimaginable violence. Brandon was led out of the room, his hands cuffed behind his back. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The woman he had once loved was gone, and so was any semblance of the life he had known. The news of Natalie's death spread quickly, and with it the whirlwind of public reaction. The media, as it often does with high-profile cases, latched on to Brandon's story, seizing on every detail that could fuel the growing debate. His name became a symbol of a broken man, a victim of betrayal and a tragic miscarriage of justice. The public couldn't stop talking about it. Brandon Webb, a man driven to the edge by years of suffering, now accused of murder. The story became a national sensation, with every aspect of his life scrutinized and debated. At first there was empathy. People saw a man who had been wrongly imprisoned, a father torn from his children, a husband betrayed in the most intimate way imaginable. Many sympathized with him. After all, who wouldn't be devastated by the realization that the person they trusted most had not only lied, but had started a new life without them? The emotional weight of Brandon's ordeal seemed to justify his violent outburst to some. To them, he was not a murderer, but a man who had been pushed beyond his limits, forced to confront the unimaginable. His actions, no matter how horrific, were seen by some as a tragic consequence of a system that had failed him and a wife who had abandoned him. But as the days wore on, the narrative began to shift. As the shock of the murder settled into the public consciousness, there were those who began to question whether Brandon's rage was a justified response to betrayal or whether it was a sign of something much darker within him. They pointed out that his actions, no matter the circumstances, were still unforgivable. A life had been taken, and the fact that it was a woman he once loved didn't make that act any. Brandon, in their eyes, was not a victim, but a man who had crossed a line that no one should ever cross. The division among the public grew as the media frenzy picked up steam. News outlets scrambled to fill in the blanks, offering different takes on Brandon's emotional state, his history, and his past life. Some painted him as a victim of circumstances, wrongfully convicted, emotionally scarred, and abandoned by the person who should have stood by him. Others focused on his crime, asking how a man could go from a father, a husband, to a murderer in such a short time. Was he justified in his actions, or had he allowed years of bitterness to consume him entirely? Could he be forgiven for taking someone's life, or was he simply a man who had become too broken to save? The public debate wasn't limited to just the media. People in Brandon's town of Brooksville debated among themselves. Some sided with him, holding on to the belief that the emotional weight of his life, his wrongful conviction, the betrayal by Natalie, the emotional isolation, had built up over the years, leading him to snap. Others, however, couldn't condone murder under any circumstances. They saw his violent act as proof of something darker, an inner rage that had always been there, simmering beneath the surface. While the public weighed in with their opinions, Brandon sat quietly in his prison cell, an unwilling participant in the spectacle that his life had become. He could hear the whispers, the divided voices from the outside world. Some offered their sympathy, others their condemnation. But to Brandon, it all felt meaningless. He had lost everything. His family, his freedom, his dignity, gone. His name, once tied to love and devotion, was now forever connected to violence and death. The legal consequences of Brandon's actions came swiftly. Once he was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, the media circus intensified. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about who he had been before, the life he had lived, and the woman he had loved. His past became as much a part of the trial as the crime itself. The case was filled with legal arguments about Brandon's emotional state, his mental health, and his capacity for violence. His defense team tried to argue that his emotional turmoil, years of wrongful imprisonment, and betrayal by his wife had pushed him to commit the unthinkable. They painted a picture of a man who had been broken by the system, a man who had been emotionally abandoned and emotionally destroyed, long before that fateful meeting with Natalie. The prosecution, however, focused on the brutal nature of Brandon's crime. They emphasized that no matter what had led him to this point, Brandon's actions could not be excused. His violent outburst was not the result of a temporary emotional lapse. It was the result of a man who had chosen to take matters into his own hands and murder the woman he had once loved. They argued that Brandon had the option of seeking help, of processing his emotions in a healthier way, but instead he allowed his anger to take control. In their view, the fact that Brandon had taken a life could never be justified, no matter the pain he had suffered. Brandon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His case was over before it had even begun. The trial lasted weeks, but the verdict was inevitable. The overwhelming evidence, coupled with his confession, left no room for doubt. Brandon was guilty of second-degree murder, and he would pay the price for his actions. But even as the gavel came down, the public's view of him remained divided. Some people still saw him as a tragic figure, while others saw him as a monster who had let his rage define him. In the days that followed, Brandon retreated into himself. Alone in his cell, he had plenty of time to reflect on what had led him to this point. He could no longer deny the crushing weight of his actions. He had taken a life, and that truth burned in his soul. But even in the silence of his prison, Brandon wrestled with his own internal conflict. Was he truly a victim of his circumstances? Was he justified in what he had done? Or was there something darker lurking inside him, something that had always been there, waiting to break free? He spent countless nights lying awake, staring up at the ceiling of his cell, unable to escape the crushing guilt that now consumed him. Could he ever forgive himself? Would anyone ever be able to see beyond the murder he had committed and understand the pain he had suffered? Was he simply a man broken by the world, or was he someone who had allowed the darkness inside him to take over? These questions haunted him, with no answers in sight. As the days passed, Brandon realized that the truth of what had happened that day would never be clear to anyone but him. He had become a symbol, a tragic story of betrayal and brokenness, but he was no longer sure who he was or what he had become. The murder was the end of one chapter, but it marked the beginning of an entirely different struggle, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Could any man have handled the level of betrayal Brandon experienced? After everything he had gone through, the wrongful imprisonment, the emotional devastation, and the ultimate discovery of his wife's deceit, was there any justification for what he did? Was Brandon right to lash out, or did his rage cross a line that can never be undone? The line between right and wrong often becomes blurred when a person is pushed to the brink. But where is the line? At what point does the pain of betrayal become a justification for violence? These are the questions that linger after Brandon's tragic actions. In the end, it's not just about the murder itself. It's about the complexity of human emotion and the extreme lengths to which it can drive us. What drives someone to murder the person they once loved? Is it love, anger, or something deeper? The answers may never be clear, but Brandon's story serves as a cautionary tale about the power of unchecked emotions and the devastating consequences that can follow. What would you have done in Brandon's shoes? Could you understand his actions, or would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you think this story is a powerful reminder of the consequences of betrayal, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime stories.